Hello everyone, I'm here to tell you some scary stories, but in a way that helps you relax and fall asleep. If you enjoy these videos, don't forget to like and subscribe, it really helps a lot. Also, tell me in the comments where are you watching from and what time is it right now. Now take a deep breath, listen to the gentle sound of the rain, and let your mind drift into the dark, peaceful world of tonight's story. Next night, I couldn't stop thinking about him. The memory of those eyes, the way he had paused on my stoop, replayed endlessly in my mind. Every street I rode down seemed suddenly dangerous, every shadow suspect. I told myself it was just one man, a random encounter. But the city had shifted, and I knew it. A few days later, I went for another ride during the day this time, trying to reclaim the streets. It felt safer. Warm sunlight replaced the oppressive shadows, and the hum of traffic and people made the city feel normal again. But as I passed familiar corners, I couldn't help scanning the sidewalks. And then, just briefly, a shadow that lingered too long, too deliberately, at the edge of vision. My pulse spiked. That night, I rode again, late, under the cover of darkness. The streets were quieter now, the hum of the city muted in the late hour. I was alert, every sense heightened. And then I saw him. He wasn't hiding, but he wasn't obvious either. Walking slowly along the sidewalk, hands in his pockets, shoulders hunched slightly. The same scruffy mid-40s appearance, not homeless, not strange in the usual sense, just ordinary. Ordinary and terrifying. I tried to rationalize it. He had probably just been out for a walk. Maybe I had imagined the intensity of his stare the other night. But my instinct screamed otherwise. Something about him was wrong. Something about the way he moved, the slight tilt of his head, the pauses, deliberate pauses, that seemed to track me, made every nerve in my body tighten. I approached cautiously, slowing my bike. The sidewalk narrowed just enough to force proximity. I didn't want to scare him. I didn't want confrontation. I wanted safety. "Hey, behind you," I said again, carefully, trying to sound light. He turned. The look in his eyes was a shock. Anger, yes, but also something colder. Recognition, like he remembered me from before. Like he had been waiting. I pedaled past as quickly as I dared, trying not to draw attention, but he followed. Not immediately, but soon I could hear the shuffle of feet behind me. At first it was faint. Then words emerged, low, venomous, almost rehearsed. "You think you can just ride past me? You little cunt. I'm going to make you regret this." The sidewalk curved. I tried to pass him quickly, but he fell, in line with my pace, keeping distance enough to appear casual, but close enough that I could hear his muttered threats. My stomach churned, my pulse raced. I didn't know what to do. Stop? Confront him? Pedal faster and risk drawing attention to myself? I made a decision I would come to regret. I looped around the block, pretended I was going somewhere else, trying to lose him. My hands were sweaty, my legs tight with tension, but when I glanced back, heart in my throat, he had anticipated it. He was standing, on my stoop, my front stoop, watching, silent. I pedaled harder, stomach twisting, trying to convince myself this was coincidence. But it wasn't. He had known where I lived. He had waited. I didn't stop until I reached my friend's place. By the time I slowed, my breath came in jagged bursts, my chest tight. I locked the bike in the alley, tried to shake the image of him from my mind. Tried to convince myself he was just some random man, an unfortunate intersection of paths. But even then, I couldn't forget the way he watched, the stillness, the intent. And deep down, a seed of dread began to grow. I wasn't safe. Not in the streets, not on the sidewalks, not anywhere near my own home. Before the accident, Emily's life was filled with a rhythm that seemed both ordinary and extraordinary. Ordinary in its routines, extraordinary in the warmth she brought to everyone around her. She was the kind of girl who could light up a room without trying, who noticed the small details that others overlooked, the crooked picture on a wall, the way a child's eyes sparkled when they discovered something new, the comforting smell of fresh bread from the cafe she worked at. Her Aunt Margaret's house was often alive with noise, laughter, chatter, the clatter of little feet racing down the hallway. Margaret had 3 children, all under the age of 4, and Emily was more than just a babysitter. She was part of the family. She helped with bedtime routines, sang lullabies, and created little worlds for the children, with stories that were sometimes fantastical, sometimes comically mundane. There was a small secret ritual she had with them, a magic handshake that no adult could replicate, reserved only for Emily and the children. It was silly, but in those moments the house felt truly safe, truly alive. Her style was iconic to those who knew her: denim dungarees, a red baseball cap often worn backward, and her favorite white jacket that seemed slightly too big, as if she wanted to wrap herself in comfort. It wasn't just clothing. It was a signature, a marker of her presence. People would notice if she wasn't wearing the cap, or if her jacket was missing. And somehow, those small details became part of the family's collective memory of her. Emily had her own circle of friends at school, and even though she was popular, she never let it change her core. She had a dry, sarcastic sense of humor, a laugh that could start in her chest and fill the room, and an uncanny ability to make people feel seen. Teachers often commented that she seemed older than her years in thoughtfulness, yet forever young in spirit. But it wasn't all sunshine and light. Emily had dreams tinged with fear and uncertainty, the kind only a teenager could feel. She often spoke about the fragility of life, the fleeting nature of happiness, and the strange sense that sometimes things weren't quite as they seemed. Margaret had laughed nervously when Emily once said, "Sometimes I feel like I'm walking in two worlds at once." At the time, it had seemed like teenage poetry or imagination, but in hindsight, those words would echo with an unsettling clarity. Evenings at Margaret's house were filled with quiet rituals: dinner, storytelling, bedtime, and the slow, comforting hum of normalcy. Emily loved to watch the construction progress at her aunt's house, sneaking in glimpses of walls being built, tiles being laid, and the home slowly taking shape. She would joke with the workers, tease the children about sneaking cookies, and leave the house with a wave and a bright smile that lingered long after she was gone. It was a life that seemed untouched by tragedy, yet in retrospect, it was a life brimming with quiet significance. Every laugh, every moment of care, every interaction with Margaret's children, the fingerprints of her presence, would leave a mark that no accident could erase. Even as the accident approached, even as fate was about to intervene, the essence of Emily's life remained vivid, anchored in the memories of those who loved her. And it was that very life, full of energy and love, that would make her absence unbearable, and her eventual return to the construction site so disturbingly tangible, because grief, as Margaret would soon discover, has a way of refusing to be confined to memory. Margaret's house had always been a place of comfort, but when the construction began, it became something different, a liminal space, caught between what was familiar and what was not yet complete. Walls rose unevenly, dust settled in corners that had yet to be finished, and the constant hum of machinery filled the air. The sounds of hammers, saws, and drilling became part of the house's rhythm, but they also masked something quieter, subtler, and unsettling. The workers were a small, tight-knit crew. They arrived early, unloading equipment with practiced efficiency, chatting idly about their days and families. Most of them were practical, grounded men who had seen more accidents than they cared to count, but even they felt a creeping unease when they first set foot in the house. Nothing obvious happened at first, just the ordinary chaos of construction, but there was a subtle shift in the atmosphere. Shadows seemed to cling to corners, tools moved slightly from where they had been left, and the air sometimes felt thick, like the house itself was holding its breath. Margaret often visited the site after work. She wore a hard hat she had borrowed from one of the workers and a dust-covered jacket, walking through the partially built rooms with an eye for detail. It was supposed to be routine: check the progress, approve materials, and leave. But the emptiness of the unfinished rooms, combined with the memory of Emily, made each visit feel heavier than it should. The children, too, felt the change. Even at the age of 2, 3, and 4, they seemed to sense that the house was different. They would pause in doorways, eyes fixed on corners that held no discernible objects, whispering about a girl who was walking and watching. Margaret dismissed it at first, attributing it to imagination and the natural fear of strange spaces. But each day their descriptions became more precise, eerily consistent, and increasingly unnerving. Workers began to notice small, inexplicable details. A hammer would be found in a different place from where it was left. Footsteps echoed on floors that no one was walking on. Sometimes, when a worker would glance at the unfinished walls, they thought they saw movement just for a second, a figure that disappeared when approached. One worker, a man named Paul, admitted he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. "It's like someone's walking behind me," he confessed to a co-worker. "But when I turn around, no one's there. And it's not just once. It's every day." Others nodded but laughed it off, attributing it to stress, fatigue, or the natural eeriness of unfinished buildings. Margaret herself began to notice subtle anomalies. Doors left open would be closed by the time she returned. Small tools would vanish and reappear in impossible places. It was frustrating, yes, but beneath the frustration was a gnawing sense that the house was not entirely empty. She couldn't explain it. And at times, when she walked alone through the bare rooms, she felt an almost imperceptible warmth brushing past her shoulders, as though someone familiar had passed by. At first, Margaret tried to rationalize every event, the draft from the open windows, her own fatigue, or the children's imagination. But she couldn't shake the feeling that the house itself carried a memory, and that memory was beginning to make itself known in ways that no one could ignore. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible, a shadow at the corner of a room, a glimpse of movement out of the corner of one's eye. But as the days passed, the workers began to speak of a girl who seemed to appear again and again, wandering the construction site without purpose, always silent, always watching, and Margaret, though she would not yet admit it, began to feel a cold whisper at the edge of her awareness, that Emily, her bright laughing niece, might not be entirely gone. It began with a phone call. Margaret was at work, her mind occupied with meetings and paperwork, when her phone rang. The number was unfamiliar. She hesitated, answering with a polite, professional tone that did little to prepare her for what was coming. Hi, Mom," a young male voice stammered. "I'm one of the construction workers at your house. I don't really know how to say this, but there's a girl." Margaret frowned, confusion furrowing her brow. "A girl? What do you mean?" "Well, she's been coming to the site for weeks now. I've seen her myself, and so have the other guys. She just walks around, doesn't talk to anyone, doesn't do anything really, but she's there, and she's always the same. Every time we see her, she's there. We don't know what to do." Margaret's first instinct was disbelief. Teenagers sometimes wandered neighborhoods, but the house was under construction. A tangle of tools, dust, and scaffolding. Why would a girl keep returning to a site like that? "Can you describe her?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. The description hit her like a cold wind. Long brown hair, red baseball cap, denim dungarees, white jacket. She's maybe 17 or 18. Margaret's grip on the phone tightened. The words were impossible. The girl they were describing, Emily, had died just a few weeks ago. The laughter, the warmth, the life she had brought into the world, all of it had ended. And yet, here was a group of practical, no-nonsense workers reporting the impossible. "Are you sure?" she asked, though the fear in her chest made her words tremble. "Yes," the worker said. "We see her almost every day. Some days she just stands there. Some days she walks around. None of us know who she is. She doesn't answer when we talk to her." Margaret couldn't breathe. She excused herself from work, her hands shaking, her mind racing with disbelief and terror. She drove straight to the house, replaying every memory of Emily, the way she had worn that jacket, the red baseball cap that never left her head. The denim overalls, she insisted, were cool, and now the same girl was reportedly wandering the house that was still under construction, appearing and disappearing without explanation. When she arrived, the workers gathered nervously near the unfinished living room. Margaret held up a photograph of Emily, her hands trembling. "This is my niece," she said softly. "Do you see? Is this her?" There was a long pause. Then one by one they nodded, their faces pale. "Yeah, that's the girl," Paul said finally, his voice low. "That's exactly her." Margaret's knees went weak. She sank onto a wooden beam, trying to steady herself. Questions swirled in her mind. How could this be happening? Was it grief, a hallucination, or something far darker? The rational part of her wanted to dismiss it, to call it coincidence, but every rational thought was drowned in the overwhelming certainty that the girl the workers saw was her Emily. As Margaret left the site that day, her mind replayed the images of her niece, the red cap, the denim dungarees, the white jacket, over and over. She could almost hear Emily's laughter echoing in the half-built rooms, mingling with the creaks and groans of the unfinished house. And that laughter, once so full of life, now carried an undertone that made her skin crawl, a haunting echo of what had been, and a terrifying suggestion of what might still linger. The first sighting was not an isolated incident. It would not be the last. Chapter 4 establishes the first direct encounter, making the story unmistakably paranormal, while keeping the tension grounded in a realistic documentary style. Next, Chapter 5, Uneasy. Conversations can explore Margaret and the family's attempts to process the sightings, their growing fear, and the slow acknowledgement that something unexplainable is happening. Margaret couldn't sleep that night. The image of Emily, standing silently among scaffolding and dust, kept replaying in her mind. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind through the half-built walls sounded like footsteps. The house, even in its incomplete state, felt alive and terrifyingly familiar. She called her sister-in-law, Margaret's brother's wife, in the late hours, her voice trembling. "Something's happening at the house," she admitted. "The workers. They're seeing her. Emily." There was silence on the other end, then a soft, almost incredulous voice. You mean she's alive? But she died. We were there. We saw her." "I know," Margaret said, tears welling in her eyes. "I saw the pictures they sent. They described her exactly like she used to be. Cap, jacket, everything." Her sister-in-law's voice wavered. "It can't be. Maybe it's someone else. Maybe someone dressing like her as a prank?" Margaret shook her head, though no one could see it. "It's not a prank. They've seen her for weeks. All of them. I don't know what to think." The next day, Margaret sat down with her immediate family. Her brother, the children's father, looked skeptical but concerned. "You're sure it's not just a coincidence? Or maybe the workers are exaggerating?" "I wish it was," Margaret said. She laid the photo of Emily on the table. "This is who they're seeing, and they all insist. It's her." Her parents were quieter, faces pale and drawn. The idea of a child now gone, appearing as a presence in their home, was not just impossible, it was horrifying. Margaret's father broke the silence, his voice low and strained. "Maybe it's grief. Maybe we're all seeing what we want to see. Maybe it's our minds playing tricks. But the workers," Margaret asked, "they don't know Emily. They wouldn't know her jacket, her cap, the overalls. How could they?" Her brother had no answer. He didn't even try to speak. He just stared at the photograph, as if it might suddenly come alive. Even the children, unaware of death in the way adults understand it, spoke of the girl in the house. "She's walking there," the youngest said one evening, pointing toward the half-finished hallway. "She's smiling. She likes us." Margaret forced a smile, telling herself it was imagination, but the consistency, the repetition, gnawed at her. Over the following days, Margaret tried to rationalize every detail. She visited the site during the day, walked through the partially built rooms and saw nothing herself. But the workers' reports didn't falter. Footsteps, shadows, fleeting glimpses of movement. One worker, normally stoic and reserved, confessed he could no longer work without feeling watched. "It's like she's always there," he said. "And she knows we know she's there." Margaret left the house that day shaken. In the quiet of her car, she realized what she hadn't admitted to anyone, that she too felt it. A presence. Something alive, something familiar, moving in the spaces that were supposed to be empty. The thought terrified her, yet it was wrapped in grief. A longing to see Emily again, to hear her laugh, to know she was safe. And deep down, Margaret knew that this was only the beginning. The girl they all saw, her Emily, was not merely passing through the house. She was leaving an impression, a trace of something that refused to be dismissed, a presence that would not be ignored. In the days to come, uneasy conversations would multiply. Family, workers, and neighbors would whisper, speculate, argue. Rational explanations would be exhausted, tested, and ultimately rejected. And slowly, the line between grief and reality, memory and presence, life and death would begin to blur. Margaret returned to the construction site the following morning with a photograph of Emily in her hands. It was a simple snapshot, taken weeks before the accident. Emily in her signature denim dungarees, red baseball cap perched backward on her head, and that unmistakable white jacket draped over her shoulders. She had been smiling, eyes bright, caught mid-laugh as if life itself had paused just for her. The workers gathered around her hesitantly, unsure what to expect. Some had already whispered rumors among themselves, casting nervous glances toward the half-built walls. Others were skeptical despite their repeated sightings. This is my niece," Margaret said, her voice trembling but firm. She held the photo out for all of them to see. Have you seen her? Do you recognize her?" Paul, the oldest and most experienced worker, took the photograph in his hands. His face went pale as he studied it, his knuckles whitening. It's her," he said finally, almost a whisper. That's the girl we've been seeing." One by one, the other workers nodded, some shaking, some silent, all tense. The confirmation hit Margaret like a physical blow. The girl wandering the construction site, the one who appeared without explanation, without speech, without reason, was undeniably Emily. The impossible had become reality. "What? What does she want?" asked a young worker, his voice barely audible. "Why is she here?" Margaret didn't answer. She couldn't. She had no answers, only a gut-wrenching, bone-deep certainty that her niece's presence was more than a hallucination or coincidence. The reality of it, of Emily moving unseen through the unfinished rooms, observed and reported by people who had no reason to fabricate such a story, was terrifying. A faint creak echoed from the floor above. All eyes turned toward the empty skeletal structure. No one moved. No one spoke. The air seemed to grow colder, heavier, as though the house itself was holding its breath. Margaret felt a shiver run down her spine. For a moment, she could almost hear the faint echo of Emily's laughter, like a distant memory brushing against the present. "It's her," Paul said again, voice shaking. "There's no mistaking it. We've seen her every day, and now I know why." He swallowed hard, glancing at the unfinished walls. "It's like she never left." Margaret nodded slowly, a tear rolling down her cheek. The photograph, once a comforting memory, had become a conduit to something far beyond her comprehension. Emily, though gone from the world of the living, had returned in a way that defied logic. She had crossed a boundary, and no rational explanation could account for it. The workers exchanged uneasy glances, fear mingling with disbelief. Some shifted their weight from foot to foot, as though the simple act of standing in the house had become unbearable. Margaret sensed the collective tension pressing down on the room, an almost physical weight that demanded acknowledgement. That day, nothing else seemed to matter. The walls, the dust, the tools, all of it faded into the background of a single horrifying truth. Emily's presence was real, undeniable, and unavoidable. And Margaret understood, in that gut-wrenching moment, that their lives had changed forever. As they left the site, each worker casting nervous glances behind them, Margaret lingered. Her gaze swept over the skeletal structure, imagining Emily moving silently through it. She could feel her niece's essence in the air, the warmth, the energy, the echo of life that had not yet faded. It was the photograph that made the impossible undeniable. It was the photograph that confirmed what they had all been too afraid to admit. The girl at the construction site was Emily, alive in a way that no one could explain, walking among them, tethered to the world she had left behind. And for Margaret, the fear, grief, and awe all collided into a single, terrifying certainty. Whatever Emily wanted, whatever had brought her back, it was not yet finished. It started subtly. At first, Margaret didn't notice the faint disturbances at night, or she dismissed them as the creaks and groans of a house still under construction. But soon, the ordinary noises of settling wood and shifting scaffolding were joined by something far less explainable. The workers were the first to report it. Some claimed to hear footsteps echoing through the empty rooms after the sun had set, footsteps that didn't belong to anyone. Others spoke of doors opening and closing on their own, small tools vanishing only to reappear in different places, and shadows that seemed to move independently of the light. One night, Paul swore he had seen a figure in the doorway, just a silhouette of a girl. before blinking and finding nothing. Margaret tried to dismiss it, clinging to logic. Yet as she returned home in the evenings, she began to feel it herself. A presence that lingered just beyond sight, brushing against her shoulder or trailing along the edges of her vision. The sensation was unnerving, like the house was breathing around her, alive with a memory she could neither see nor touch but could undeniably feel. The children, as always, were eerily perceptive. "She's walking again," the youngest whispered one night, pointing toward the empty hallway. "She's happy." Their innocent observation, usually dismissed, carried a weight now. Margaret realized the children weren't imagining it. They were seeing something real. Something Emily. One evening, Margaret stayed late at the site, ostensibly to check on a delivery of materials. The sun had set, and the skeletal house loomed like a shadow against the darkening sky. As she walked through the half-finished living room, she heard a soft shuffle behind her, like the brush of a footstep on unfinished wood. "Emily?" she whispered, her voice barely audible, her heart hammering. Silence. Then a faint sound, almost a giggle, echoed through the open beams above. Margaret froze, a cold chill running down her spine. The air felt thicker, charged, as if the house itself were aware of her presence. She spun around, but the empty corridors stared back, silent and still. The workers began refusing to stay late after that. Shadows seemed to grow darker in corners, where light should have reached, and the feeling of being watched became inescapable. Tools they had set down in one place were found in impossible locations, and lights would flicker without cause. Margaret started sleeping poorly, haunted by images of Emily wandering the empty site at night. She imagined her niece peering through the skeletal walls, small hands touching the unfinished beams, red cap perfectly in place, denim overalls moving silently. And though Margaret's grief was raw, she could not deny the presence. It was not malicious but insistent, lingering like a memory refusing to fade. The house had become a threshold, a place where the boundary between life and death thinned. And as the night stretched on, Margaret knew with a sinking certainty that Emily's visits were not random. They were deliberate. The girl who had once laughed and played among the children of the house was still tethered to it, still moving within it, still watching over those she loved in a way only a spirit could. That first night of true haunting left Margaret shaken. The workers whispered among themselves. The children spoke in low tones of a girl who likes to walk, and Margaret, alone in the quiet, understood that Emily had not only returned, she had made herself known, and nothing would ever make the house feel empty again. Chapter 7 escalates the haunting, showing that Emily's presence is no longer limited to daylight sightings. Nighttime phenomena, footsteps, shadows, moving objects, make the story increasingly tense and terrifying. Next is Chapter 8, Children's Reactions, focusing on how the youngest family members perceive Emily's presence, and add an innocent but unsettling perspective. Children often see what adults cannot. Their imaginations are fertile, their minds open, and their perceptions untarnished by skepticism or fear of ridicule. In Margaret's household, this truth became frighteningly clear. At first, the children's comments were dismissed as ordinary childish chatter. The youngest, barely 2, would point toward the unfinished hallway and giggle. "She's walking!" the child would announce, eyes wide with delight. "She likes us." Margaret's older children, 3 and 4, offered more detailed accounts. "She has a red hat," one said matter-of-factly, "and a white jacket." "She smiles." Another added, "She helps me build blocks when you're gone." Margaret forced herself to smile, to rationalize. "It's just your imagination," she said softly, kneeling beside them. "There's no one there." "It's just the house." But their eyes, bright, unflinching, innocent, told a different story. They spoke with conviction, recounting the girl's actions, her gestures, the way she moved quietly through the empty rooms. Each child's description matched the others, down to the tiniest detail. Denim overalls, red cap, white jacket. Margaret began keeping a notebook, jotting down their statements. She noted times, locations, even small reactions, how the children would suddenly stop playing and stare at corners, or how they would whisper to each other about Emily helping or Emily watching. One evening, as Margaret cleaned up after dinner, she overheard a startling conversation between the children. "She said hello," the youngest whispered. "I told her good night," replied the older child. "She's waiting for us to play tomorrow," the youngest added. Margaret froze. They weren't inventing games. They were interacting with someone or something that she could neither see nor touch. And yet their calm certainty was chilling. There was no fear in their voices, only recognition, affection, and trust. It was then that Margaret realized the depth of Emily's presence. The children sensed it as a natural extension of their world, just as they might sense a parent's return home. And that realization was terrifying. The house, unfinished and exposed, had become a stage for the impossible. Even at night, when Margaret tried to rest, the children's voices echoed faintly in her memory. Laughter, chatter, tiny footsteps moving unseen. They were the first to welcome Emily back, the first to perceive her as more than a memory. And through their innocence, Margaret began to see the truth. Emily was not a ghost bound by fear or anger. She was something more, an echo of life itself, tethered to the house, tethered to the family she loved, moving unseen yet undeniable. By the end of the week, Margaret's household had changed. The children spoke freely of Emily, pointing out shadows, giggling at flickering lights, and leaving toys where she might want to play. Margaret, exhausted and terrified, had no choice but to accept what the children already knew. Her niece's presence was real, her influence palpable, and her visits frequent. It was the innocent voices of the children, pure and unafraid. That marked the true arrival of Emily at the house, a presence that no adult could deny, and one that would not easily be forgotten. Chapter 8 emphasizes the uncanny clarity with which children perceive Emily, contrasting their innocence with adult fear, and deepening the story's emotional and eerie impact. Grief is a peculiar, relentless force. It twists the world, distorts perception, and weighs heavily on the mind and body. For Margaret, the presence of Emily in the half-built house magnified every ache of loss she had ever felt. Each time she thought she understood, her niece was gone. The impossible intrusion of Emily's spirit reminded her otherwise. Margaret spent long nights awake, haunted not just by memories, but by the questions that had no answers. Why Emily? Why now? Was her niece trapped between worlds, unable to move on? Or was she returning deliberately, seeking something that Margaret could not yet comprehend? The guilt was the sharpest blade. Margaret replayed the accident endlessly in her mind. Could she have done something to prevent it? Should she have insisted Emily drive differently? Avoided that street, been home sooner? Rational thought clashed violently with irrational blame, leaving her exhausted and raw. Even more troubling was the knowledge that Emily's presence was intertwined with the house, the very home Margaret had hoped would be a safe sanctuary. Every time she walked through the unfinished rooms, she felt a mixture of relief, longing, and fear. Relief that Emily was somehow still present, longing to see her laughter and warmth once more, and fear of the unknown, the inexplicable, the supernatural that she could neither control nor understand. She began to confide in close family members, speaking in hushed tones late at night. "I feel like she's here because of me," Margaret admitted to her brother one evening. "Like she's tethered to the house and to me. And I don't know if I should feel comforted or terrified." Her brother, usually practical and skeptical, only shook his head. "We can't blame ourselves," he said softly. "Accidents happen. You can't carry the weight of what we couldn't prevent." But words offered little solace. Margaret's nights were filled with dreams, or were they memories? Of Emily wandering the house, calling softly, her red cap bright in the dim shadows, her denim overalls brushing against walls, her laughter echoing faintly like a ghost of a summer day. The guilt extended beyond herself. She worried for the workers, the children, everyone who had witnessed Emily. Were they safe? Were they being drawn into something they could not escape? Every fleeting shadow, every unexplained sound, became a reminder that the living and the dead were now entwined in a fragile, terrifying balance. Margaret tried rituals of remembrance, lighting candles, placing photos, leaving small toys in the unfinished rooms, but none of it brought clarity. Instead, it seemed to invite more presence, more signs of Emily's lingering spirit. Every attempt to honor or comfort her only reinforced the reality. Emily had not moved on. She had returned, tethered to love, tethered to the house, tethered to the lives she had touched so briefly yet profoundly. And in that realization, Margaret felt both awe and terror. The grief she had known for weeks now became a living thing, interwoven with the house itself. The guilt, the longing, the fear. They were no longer private burdens, but elements in a story that the entire household could feel. Margaret understood, with a sinking clarity, that nothing would ever be the same. The house, her family, and her life were now part of Emily's presence, and the boundaries between past, present, and whatever lay beyond had begun to blur. Margaret had reached a point where ignoring what was happening was no longer an option. Emily's presence was undeniable, not just in fleeting sightings, but in the steady accumulation of evidence, whispered voices, moving shadows, the children's consistent accounts, and the workers' repeated confirmations. The house under construction had become a stage for the impossible, and Margaret knew that documenting it might be the only way to make sense of the events, or at least survive them. She began by inviting a few close neighbors, friends and family members, to visit the house during the day. Margaret hoped their presence might either confirm the sightings or reassure her that she wasn't losing her mind. The first visit was uneventful, or so it seemed. At first, the visitors noticed the unfinished walls, the scattered tools, the smell of sawdust. But as they moved deeper into the skeletal structure, subtle signs began to appear. A chair that had been leaning against a wall was now in the middle of a room. A toolbox slid slightly along a surface as if nudged. And then, in a beam of sunlight streaming through the unfinished ceiling, a shadow flitted across the floor. Small, quick, unmistakably human-shaped. One neighbor, Mrs. Harris, whispered in disbelief. Did you see that? There's a child, or someone small moving just there." Margaret held her breath, heart pounding. She knew what they were seeing. The shadow's movements mirrored Emily's playful, curious gait, the same likeness she had once carried through the house when alive. The children, predictably, were unfazed. They pointed out corners and empty spaces, smiling as though introducing their aunt's guests to a familiar friend. "She's over there," the oldest said confidently, pointing toward an unfinished doorway. "She wants to show you her blocks." Margaret attempted to record the occurrences. She set up a small digital camera on a tripod, hoping to catch even a fleeting glimpse. Footsteps, shadows, and small movements were faintly visible on the grainy footage, subtle enough to be dismissed by skeptics, but the consistency was alarming. As days passed, the family invited more visitors, cousins, distant relatives, and trusted friends. Each person witnessed phenomena: footsteps, brief glimpses of a girl in a red cap, whispers echoing from empty rooms, and objects slightly displaced. The consistency was chilling. No one could deny what was happening. No one could offer a rational explanation that satisfied Margaret's mind. The investigations only deepened the mystery. Margaret began keeping meticulous notes: dates, times, locations, descriptions, and the reactions of everyone involved. She observed patterns. Emily appeared most frequently in certain rooms, often near where she had played with the children, and sometimes at unexpected times of day, moving silently through the site, as though checking on the progress of her unfinished home. One evening, Margaret reviewed the footage. The grainy black and white image of a small figure, cap and jacket unmistakable, walking slowly across the room, left her breathless. She froze the frame, tracing the outline of the girl's shoulders, the swing of her arms, the tilt of her head. It was Emily, no doubt about it. The visitors left with a mixture of awe, fear, and disbelief. Some refused to return, unwilling to confront the inexplicable. Others, particularly those with children of their own, expressed cautious acceptance. But all were affected. Even skeptics could no longer dismiss what they had seen. Margaret, alone later that night, realized the weight of what she had uncovered. This was not a random haunting. This was Emily, alive in presence, tethered to her home, to the children, to the family. The investigations had confirmed it, and yet the questions multiplied. Why was she here? What did she want? And how long would she remain? The house had become a nexus, a place where grief, memory, and the impossible converged. And Margaret understood with chilling clarity: the deeper she investigated, the more she risked confronting a truth she might not be able to bear. Chapter 10 establishes the family's attempts to document Emily, introduces witnesses, and builds a foundation for more disturbing phenomena. With repeated sightings and subtle, undeniable phenomena, the family and workers found themselves facing the impossible. The ordinary explanations, The wind, faulty construction, imagination had all been exhausted. Each new encounter, each whispered voice or fleeting shadow, forced them to confront something far beyond their understanding. Discussions began cautiously, first among the workers during lunch breaks. Paul, usually pragmatic and reserved, spoke with an uneasy certainty. "I've seen things," he admitted. "Footsteps, shadows. I know it's her. But why is she here? What is she doing?" Others speculated in hushed tones. "Maybe she's trapped," one worker suggested. "Maybe something happened. And she can't move on." A few scoffed, but even their laughter carried an edge of tension. At home, Margaret and her family wrestled with the same questions. Over cups of tea and sleepless nights, they explored possibilities, psychological, spiritual, and even superstitious. Margaret's brother suggested grief-induced visions, the mind's way of coping with loss. "Maybe we're seeing what we want to see," he said, voice heavy with doubt. But Margaret could not accept that. The workers, strangers to Emily, had described her with exact detail. The children had interacted with her as if she were alive. Logic and reason faltered in the face of such unanimity. Some neighbors, drawn by curiosity and whispers, offered theories rooted in folklore. One elderly woman, Mrs. Callahan, spoke softly of spirits who linger when life is cut short. "Sometimes," she said, "the soul isn't ready to leave. Sometimes it returns to what it loved, what it cared for, or what it couldn't finish." Margaret shivered. Could Emily's attachment to the house, to the children, to her family be the reason she had returned? Was this presence not malevolent, but a tethered love refusing to fade? Others suggested unfinished business. The house itself, incomplete and chaotic, might have drawn Emily's spirit. "Maybe she's waiting for it to be done," Paul said one afternoon, "like she wants to see it finished. Maybe that's why she keeps coming back." The conversations grew heated at times. Rationality clashed with superstition. Skepticism wrestled with fear. But one thing became clear. Whether by spirit, memory, or some unknown force, Emily's presence was undeniably connected to the physical world. The boundaries of life and death, of seen and unseen, were no longer absolute in Margaret's home. Late at night, Margaret reflected on the conversations. She realized that the theories, logical or folkloric, were only a framework to help them understand what could not be explained. The truth, whatever it was, remained elusive, and the more they tried to name it, categorize it, or rationalize it, the more it seemed to resist understanding. What was clear, however, was that Emily's presence was deliberate. She was not a fleeting apparition or a random echo. She was moving with intention, tethered to her family, tethered to the house, tethered to something she could not, or would not, leave behind. Margaret understood with a mix of dread and awe. There were no easy answers. Theories could only point to possibilities, but the reality, the haunting, the presence, the child who walked unseen among them, was beyond comprehension. And in that realization lay the sharp edge of terror. The haunting was real, persistent and irrevocable. Chapter 11 expands on possible explanations, blending rational thought, folklore, and the growing tension of Emily's presence. By now there could be no doubt. The house was alive in a way that defied logic. Subtle disturbances had escalated into undeniable phenomena that left even the most skeptical observers shaken. It started with objects. Small tools left on workbenches moved inexplicably. Hammers shifted a few inches, screwdrivers rolled across floors, and buckets of nails were found scattered in corners where no one had placed them. Workers dismissed it initially. Gravity, vibration from heavy machinery, an inattentive hand, but the consistency, the precision of the movements made rational explanations impossible. Lights flickered without cause. Electrical wiring, carefully inspected by professionals, showed no faults. Still, bulbs would dim, then flare, as if responding to an unseen presence. The children's laughter, light, innocent, sometimes echoed when no one was nearby, following by tiny footsteps on the bare floors, and then came the shadows. Movement at the edge of vision, a flicker, a blur, a glimpse of a small figure in a red cap disappearing behind an unfinished wall. Workers began reporting that these glimpses were accompanied by a strange warmth, almost like a breath of life before vanishing abruptly. One evening, Paul and two other workers stayed late to finish tiling in the kitchen area. They had been joking nervously about the girl in the red cap when suddenly all three froze. A faint giggle, soft, airy, unmistakably female, echoed across the empty room. "Did you hear that?" whispered one worker, voice tight. Before anyone could respond, a white jacket drifted past in their peripheral vision, floating as if carried by an invisible breeze. The workers turned toward the movement, but the space was empty. The only trace of presence was the sudden cold that filled the room, settling into their bones. Margaret, observing from the doorway, felt the hairs on her arms stand on end. She saw the workers pale and uneasy, and the familiar sensation of being watched pressed against her back. The unfinished house, the skeletal beams, and scattered tools all seemed secondary now to the overwhelming awareness that Emily was present, deliberately, insistently. Even attempts to record the phenomena on camera produced eerie results. Grainy images showed faint outlines of a small figure where no one had been standing, blurred but recognizable. Denim overalls, white jacket, red cap. The footage was never conclusive, never perfectly clear, but enough to confirm what Margaret and the workers already suspected. Emily was here, and she was moving among them. The children, of course, remained unfazed. They greeted the flickering shadows as old friends, placed toys where Emily might like them, and spoke to the invisible presence as if it were ordinary. Their innocent interactions, once comforting, now amplified the eeriness of the situation. Margaret began to realize the house itself had become a living conduit for Emily's presence. The walls, floors, and unfinished beams were no longer inert. They were vessels for memory, grief, and the impossible. Every creak, every flicker, every moved object was a whisper of her niece, a reminder that life and death were not as separate as they had seemed. And yet, in the midst of fear, there was an undeniable tenderness. Emily's presence was not malevolent. It was deliberate, protective, tethered to the house and the family she loved. It was a haunting, yes, but one born from love, grief, and unfinished connection rather than anger or malice. Margaret understood that they were witnessing something extraordinary, terrifying and profoundly intimate. The phenomena were escalating, and the house was no longer merely a construction site. It had become a stage for the living memory of a girl who refused to be forgotten. It was late afternoon, the golden light of the setting sun streaming through the skeletal windows of the half-built house. Margaret had returned alone, determined to check the progress of the construction and secretly hoping for a glimpse of the presence that had haunted her family for weeks. The air was heavy with dust, the scent of sawdust and fresh timber mingling with something intangible, an almost imperceptible warmth that made her skin tingle. She moved cautiously through the living room, careful not to startle anything or anyone, though she told herself that what she was seeking might not be startled at all. Then she saw her. A flash of red at the edge of her vision made her heart stop. Margaret froze, breath catching in her throat. There at the far end of the room stood a small figure, denim dungarees, white jacket, and the unmistakable red baseball cap. Emily, Margaret's knees threatened to buckle. The girl was alive in every detail she remembered. The slight tilt of her head, the familiar sway of her body, the softness of her movements. And yet she was different, ethereal, impossibly light, as if she were part of the air itself, hovering slightly above the wooden floorboards. "Emily," Margaret whispered, voice trembling. Her words hung in the space like fragile glass, afraid to break the spell. The girl looked up, her gaze meeting Margaret's. There was no fear in her eyes, no anger, no confusion, only recognition. She raised a small hand in a gesture Margaret remembered from childhood. The wave she had used to say hello, to say goodbye, to say she was always near. Margaret's vision blurred with tears. I don't understand," she choked out. "Why are you here?" Emily tilted her head slightly, as if considering the question. Then she turned and walked slowly toward the staircase, leading to the unfinished upper floor. Margaret followed, every step feeling surreal, almost like moving through a dream she couldn't wake from. As she reached the staircase, Emily paused, looking back at her with a smile. A small, sad, comforting smile. Margaret could feel it in her chest, a mixture of joy, sorrow, and longing. Then, as silently as she had appeared, Emily vanished, leaving only a faint shimmer in the air and a sudden chill that pressed against Margaret's skin. For several moments, Margaret stood frozen, trying to comprehend what she had just witnessed. Her heart pounded, her mind reeled, and yet a profound sense of connection lingered. Emily was here, undeniably tethered to this house, tethered to the family she had loved so fiercely, and now Margaret understood the weight of that presence. When she returned home that evening, Margaret felt both awe and terror. She could not explain what she had seen, could not rationalize it, and could not pretend it had not happened. The boundaries between life and death, presence and absence had been shattered, and yet in the midst of fear there was a strange comfort. Emily was here, not as a ghost of grief or loss, but as a living memory, a tethered spirit insisting that love, connection, and family could not be so easily severed. Margaret realized then that this encounter, this direct vision of her niece, was only the beginning. The house, the family, and Emily herself were now intertwined in ways no one could have anticipated, and the world they thought they understood would never feel the same again. The days following Margaret's direct sighting were filled with a new kind of tension. Emily's presence, once sporadic and fleeting, now seemed purposeful. The children had noticed it first, of course. Toys rearranged in precise patterns, blocks stacked into shapes the children insisted Emily wanted them to make, and even small drawings left in unexpected places that bore the unmistakable essence of her playful. A touch. Margaret began noticing signs herself. A note, written in faint smudges of dust on a wooden beam, read simply, "I'm here." At first she thought it accidental, perhaps a handprint left by a child. But the handwriting, delicate and precise, matched her niece's perfectly. One evening, Margaret found a small grouping of objects: her niece's favorite doll, a red cap, and a toy truck, arranged at the center of the unfinished living room floor. They were positioned deliberately, almost ceremoniously. Margaret shivered as she realized it was a message, an attempt at communication. Emily wasn't simply wandering. She was trying to convey something. Even the workers, who had been desensitized to the strangeness of the house, began noticing patterns. Tools left in odd positions, small scratches along walls forming shapes that resembled letters, the faint sound of footsteps pacing in sequences that corresponded to simple knocks or signals. They were all part of Emily's silent language. Margaret, desperate for understanding, began documenting these signs meticulously. She created a journal recording every note, every arrangement, every whispered sound. Each entry revealed a pattern. Emily's presence was consistent, deliberate, and often playful, but never harmful. The children, naturally attuned to Emily's intentions, acted as interpreters. "She wants us to build this," said the youngest, pointing to a tower of blocks. "She's telling us to put the red one on top." And indeed, when Margaret followed the suggestion, she noticed the small detail she had missed. The red block formed a tiny arrow, pointing toward a pile of construction blueprints on a nearby table. Margaret realized the significance immediately. Emily was guiding her, not just making her presence known, but directing her attention. The messages were small, subtle, almost imperceptible, but they were unmistakable once recognized. It was both comforting and unnerving. Emily's spirit was no longer a shadow flitting through walls or a whispering presence in the dark. She was an active participant, communicating with those she had left behind, bridging the impossible divide between life and death. And Margaret understood, with both awe and fear, that this was only the beginning. Emily's messages were not merely playful, they were deliberate, purposeful, and hinted at a larger story yet to be revealed. The house, the family, and the workers had become participants in a silent dialogue with the girl who refused to be forgotten. And as the days wore on, the subtle messages grew bolder, more intricate and impossible to ignore. Nightfall brought a new intensity to the house. The skeletal beams, the unfinished walls, and the empty hallways seemed to pulse with life as the shadows lengthened and the air grew heavy. Emily's presence, once subtle and fleeting, now became pronounced, deliberate, and impossible to ignore. Margaret was the first to notice the change. While checking the construction site one evening, she heard soft tapping, gentle, deliberate, almost like Morse code, emanating from the unfinished staircase. Pausing, she strained to listen, counting the taps. 1, 2, 3. Pause. 1, 2. Her heart pounded. The sequence repeated, rhythmical and intentional. The children confirmed it the next day. "She tapped like that last night," the youngest whispered. "She's talking to us." Their innocence made the haunting simultaneously comforting and terrifying. Margaret realized that the patterns weren't random. They were messages carefully placed in sound, movement, and arrangement. Lights flickered in sequences. Dim, bright, dim, dim, bright. Margaret mapped the flashes in her journal and noticed a pattern resembling letters, E-M-I-L-Y. It was unmistakable. The house itself had become a medium for communication. Each object, sound, and movement a deliberate signal. Even the workers, hardened by construction and skeptical of the supernatural, began reporting experiences at night. Footsteps pacing along the unfinished floors, whispers echoing through empty corridors, and a fleeting glimpse of a small figure in her red cap appeared consistently after dark. One night, Paul described seeing a small hand place a tool in exactly the right position, then vanish as if it had never been touched. Margaret began staying at the site overnight. She set up cameras and voice recorders, documenting every unusual sound, every shadow, every movement. The recordings captured whispers she could not explain, subtle knocks corresponding to her niece's name, and fleeting glimpses of a figure too quick to identify clearly on tape. The children often stayed awake with her, clutching blankets, eyes wide as they identified patterns the adults missed. "She's pointing this way," the eldest said, tugging Margaret toward the staircase. There on the floor, a pattern of scattered nails and screws formed a crude arrow, directing her to a stack of plans and a small drawing Emily had apparently left weeks earlier. Margaret understood that Emily's nocturnal signs were more than playful. They were intentional. Her niece was guiding, communicating, insisting that those left behind notice the smallest details, recognize the messages hidden in plain sight, and perhaps prepare for something none of them yet understood. Fear and awe intertwined. Margaret could not deny what she was witnessing. The house had transformed into a living, breathing conduit for Emily's presence. Night after night, the signs grew bolder, more intricate, and more impossible to ignore. Shadows stretched, footsteps echoed, whispers carried through empty spaces, and objects arranged themselves into patterns that spoke clearly to those who paid attention. And Margaret realized something chilling. The nighttime was when Emily's spirit was most active, most aware and most capable of communicating. The veil between worlds thinned, the house pulsed with intention, and the family, and all who entered, were caught in a dialogue with a presence both loving and unnervingly persistent. The messages, she knew, were no longer optional to acknowledge. They demanded attention, they demanded understanding, and they hinted at a deeper truth, one that Margaret feared she was not yet ready to confront. Until now, the workers had approached the house with a mixture of skepticism, curiosity, and unease. They were practical men, used to the unpredictability of construction, collapsing scaffolding, rogue nails, and creaking beams. Yet nothing in their experience could prepare them for the persistent, inexplicable presence that had begun to dominate the site. Paul, the oldest and most grounded worker, was the first to openly admit his fear. "I don't know what to do anymore," he confessed one morning, voice low and shaking. "I see her. I hear her. I feel like she's right there behind me, even when I'm alone. It's not just the kids seeing things. I can feel it too." Other workers nodded in uneasy agreement, shadows moving at the corner of their vision, objects displacing themselves, and the constant soft footsteps echoing through empty rooms had become impossible to dismiss. Some had tried to rationalize the events, fatigue, imagination, drafts, but the consistency and specificity of the phenomena shattered all logic. One night, a small group stayed late to secure the scaffolding on the second floor. They had joked nervously earlier, trying to mask their fear. But as the sun disappeared and darkness filled the unfinished rooms, the house seemed to shift around them. Footsteps paced silently above their heads. A soft, airy giggle echoed through the corridors. Tools they had set down moments before moved in impossible ways. "I can't do this anymore," whispered one of the younger workers. "I'm not staying after dark. I don't care what anyone says. This is not normal." Paul, gripping the edge of a support beam, shook his head. "I've seen a lot in my life, but I've never felt like this. Like something is watching all the time." Even during the day, unease lingered. Shadows that didn't align with the sun, fleeting glimpses of a small figure in red, and inexplicable chills made every worker tense. The laughter and footsteps weren't malicious, but they were insistent, deliberate. Emily's presence was constant, omnipresent and undeniable. The crew began to speak in hushed tones about leaving, but the bond of the project, the loyalty to Margaret, and the creeping curiosity of the phenomena kept